Hope that you and your loved ones are safe and well, and thank you for your presence here today in this virtual space. We will go ahead and begin this morning's panel session. So at the outset, I want to announce that this session is being recorded, so I would encourage everyone to turn off your video cameras and microphones to help ensure your privacy, but also an interruption-free session. If you were with us for this morning's keynote panel, welcome back. And if you're just joining us, welcome to the 2020 New Jersey History Conference, sponsored by the New Jersey Historical Commission, a state agency dedicated to the advancement of public knowledge and the preservation of New Jersey history. This annual conference provides an opportunity to revisit moments in the history of New Jersey that speak to contemporary issues of pressing concern throughout the state, nation, and world. This year's gathering, titled Battles for the Ballot, New Jersey Voting Rights Then and Now, revisits 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, 150 years since the ratification of the 15th Amendment, as well as issues surrounding voting rights, access, and civic engagement that are still with us today in the state of New Jersey and nation overall. Before beginning this morning's panel, I want to quickly acknowledge additional conference sponsors, including the New Jersey State Archives, the Alice Paul Institute, the Department of American Studies at Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences, New Jersey Women Vote, the 19th Amendment at 100, and the New Jersey Digital Highway. I also want to acknowledge the tireless work of Madeline Rosenberg, Sarah Cureton, Janet Field, and Greer Luce of the New Jersey Historical Commission, as well as members of the Conference Planning Committee listed in the conference program. And my name is Jason Ambroise, member of the Planning Committee and Associate Professor of History at William Paterson University of New Jersey. And with that, I want to specifically welcome everyone to this morning's panel session titled African Americans and Voting Before the 15th Amendment. This session will revisit moments in the history of African American voting and struggles for the right to vote in New Jersey prior to the 15th Amendment's ratification in 1870. We are honored to have with us two distinguished panel presenters who will share their important research and insights, namely Nancy A. Piwowar, who is president of the Board of Trustees of the Historical Society of Plainfield, New Jersey, and Noelle Lorraine Williams, consultant with the Newark Public Library and an independent curator, artist, and writer. After their presentations, we will open the session for a question and answer period. Please do type any questions you have for our presenters in the chat window, including during their presentations. And so our first panel presenter is Nancy A. Piwowar. As already noted, Ms. Piwowar is president of the Board of Trustees of the Historical Society of Plainfield, New Jersey, where she manages the Drake House Museum. She also serves on the Plainfield Cultural and Heritage Commission and the Union County Cultural and Heritage Affairs Advisory Board. She was a research consultant in 2013 to the Plainfield NAACP for the Bedminster African Burying Ground and received a Tri-City NAACP Humanitarian and Historian Award in 2019. An author of numerous articles on local New Jersey history, Ms. Piwowar is also retired from the US Postal Service, an institution instrumental to ensuring voter access and civic engagement, as we have all witnessed this past election cycle. Her panel presentation is titled Robert Aaron, an African-American voter in 18th century New Jersey. It revisits a moment in state history when free Blacks who met a property or money requirement for suffrage were not only allowed to vote in theory, but did vote in practice. And with that, I welcome Nancy A. Piwowar.
Thank you very much. See if I can get the slideshow to work. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. And thank you, Jason and Noel. It's great to be with you on this panel. I want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission and all the staff involved in coordinating this year's 2020 New Jersey History Conference, especially Madeline Rosenberg for all her patience with all the technical aspects of making this conference virtual, and also Colleen, who's our technical expert today. I am sure that I'm missing people, but please know that I value your work on behalf of the history community. I also want to thank all of you for your interest in this topic of Robert Aaron, an African-American voter in the 18th century. This is a story that has been hidden in history and is part of the fabric that is America. By connecting the resources that I've been able to uncover, a bit of history is being preserved and returns this individual to his place in history. I am honored to tell the story of Robert Aaron and to give him a voice in New Jersey history. I have shared this story with school children who have visited the Drake House Museum to try to make history real to them. And I have told his story to a number of NAACP groups, senior citizens, church groups, and library audiences. It is a work in progress because there's always room to fill in more information as it is found. As information is added to the internet and as documents long forgotten are found, just like the plot of land in Bedminster that was hidden in plain sight. But some just wanted to forget about it. And that piece of forgotten land, a burial ground, brought Robert Aaron's story into the sunshine. How did we get here? In 2013, my friend Deborah told me about a meeting that the Plainfield chapter of the NAACP was having in Bedminster about an African American cemetery. It just so happened that I was off from my job that day, so we decided to both go to the meeting. And as they say, the rest is history. I went to a complete stranger's home and sat among a couple of residents of Bedminster, representatives of three branches of the local NAACP chapters, the Morris County chapter, the Plainfield chapter, and the Tri-City chapter. It was a discussion about a piece of real estate, a piece of land, but I was intrigued by the story of the purchase and how the free African American and two slaves were able to purchase a plot of land for a burial ground. It was at this meeting I learned Robert Aaron's name and the slaves' names. I insisted that there had to be a will and other records besides a deed of purchase had to exist. I hit a wall with some of those present, but I persisted. I needed to know these men's story. Within an hour of arriving back home, I found Robert Aaron's will notation on Ancestry.com and then requested a copy from the New Jersey State Archives. This is Robert Aaron's story. African Americans voting before the 18th century. Robert Aaron, an African American voter in the 18th century. Robert Aaron, we don't know his date of birth, but we believe his date of death is approximately 1802. Robert Aaron was a free Black man who lived in the 18th century in Bedminster, New Jersey. His story begins in 1788, 14 years before he died. His date of birth and place of birth are unknown. Was he born free? If he was born a slave, how did he become free? Up until 1788, Robert Aaron's life story is a mystery lost in history. The story of Robert Aaron begins when he married Maria Van Doren on March 20th, 1788. The marriage record of Robert Aaron and Maria Van Doren can be found in the marriage records of free Negroes, Blacks of the Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church at New Germantown, Oldwick, New Jersey. The first service of the Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church was held in the home of Marie and Jorah Van Guinea, who were also freed slaves, on August 1st, 1714. The Zion Church was built in 1749 or 50 on Main Street and Church Streets in Oldwick and is the oldest Lutheran church in New Jersey. The Zion Church edifice would have been built when Robert and Maria exchanged marriage vows. And this is the church that they was in existence and they would have been married in. This is a marriage record of Robert Aaron and Maria Van Doren, courtesy of the Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church. It's hard to see, but his name and her name are right here, and the notation says free Negroes. A year later, a little over a year later, on April 30th, 1789, Robert Aaron purchased a little over an acre of land from Peter Dacker and his wife Fincher at Lesser Crossroads in Bedminster, New Jersey for 10 pounds. A small plot of land on the main road between Bedminster and Peapack at Lesser Crossroads was described in the deed, and the deed did not indicate the race of the man. Robert Aaron was a freeholder landowner, and according to records in the New Jersey State Archives, Robert Aaron paid taxes on the land in Bedminster until his death in 1802. Thereafter, his wife Mary paid taxes on the land in Bedminster. This is a 1873 map, and you can see on this map where the arrow is the approximate location of the Robert Aaron's house would have been on this side of the road, and the burial ground is on this side of the road. Later on, you'll hear more about the innkeeper's house, which is located at the Greater Crossroads, but I wanted to show the distance between the two. Robert Aaron was a man of substance and stature. He was a voter in a number of elections for government officials. Most of you know that the New Jersey Constitution of 1776 stated that all the inhabitants of this colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds, proclamation money, clear estate in the same, and have resided within the county in which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election, shall be entitled to vote for representatives in council and assembly, and also for all other public officers that shall be elected by the people of the county at large. Then on February 22nd, 1797, the New Jersey legislature passed an act which revised the regulations for the election of public officials. 1797, an act to regulate the election of members of the Legislative Council and General Assembly, sheriffs, and coroners in this state. And Article 11 reads, and it be it enacted that all free inhabitants of the state of full age who are worth 50 pounds, proclamation money, and have resided within the county to which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election shall be entitled to vote for all public officers, which shall be elected by virtue of this act, and no person shall be entitled to vote in any other township or precinct than that in which he or she doth actually preside at the time of the election. And note that it says he or she. Women and African Americans who met the requirements voted and continue to vote in elections until 1807. Women and African Americans were disenfranchised by the New Jersey Act of 1807, which specified who shall not vote by defining who could vote. Free, white, male citizens of the state of the age of 21 years, worth 50 pounds, proclamation money, clear estate. Robert Aaron's voting record was located at the New Jersey Historical Society Manuscript Group 895 of the Bedminster Township voting records. In reviewing the Bedminster voting records, no mention is made as to the race of Robert Aaron. It should be noted that it says on this particular Somerset County Historical Quarterly that there were 3 women who were on the voting rolls. On closer examination, there were really 4: Eleanor Boylan, Sarah Eoff, Ida Gaston, and Margaret McDonald. A closer page, you can see Robert Aaron's name, and you can see Eleanor's name. The actual documents are in the New Jersey Historical Society. I tried to get a copy of them, but it's not that easy, and I'm still waiting to get a copy, but I have seen the documents, and they're really a fascinating piece of history. Robert Aaron voted in local elections of 1797, 1800, and 1801. He also voted in an election for representatives of Congress, which was held on December 23rd, 24th, 1800. No record of Robert Aaron in 1798 and 1799 could be found. Doesn't mean that he didn't vote, it's just that it might not have been there or it couldn't be found. Robert Aaron purchased land in 1789, as I said, and the extinct voting records indicate his first vote was in 1797, a municipal election, the same year as the New Jersey legislature passed the 1797 Act, which revised the regulations for the election of public officials and mentioned state. And as I said before, the location of his house was approximately here, and the inn where he voted is down here at Greater Crossroads. On this map, you can see it's a comparison of the location of his house on Hillside Avenue. And he had to travel down Lamington Road. It says it's a 5-minute drive. It's 2.3 miles down to where he would have voted at the inn in 17 in the 1800s. Further down this road, if you want to get a directional, is the Trump National Golf Course. It's further down on 523. This is a picture of the inn of John Van Din on Lamington Road in Bedminster. It's a private residence, and this is where Robert Aaron would have voted. On October 10th, 1797, there is no location that was indicated on the voting records, and he voted for an election for council, assembly, sheriff, and coroners, and there were 130 votes cast. On October 14th, this is where he would have voted, 15th, 1800. There was an election for council, assembly, sheriff, and coroners. There are 118 names on the poll list. The numbers that you see next to those numbers is the number on the first election. He was the 107th voter. On the next election, he was the 64th voter. On December 23rd, 24th, 1800, where there was the election for the House of Representatives, there were 121 names on the voter list. He was the 85th voter. On October 13th and 14th, 1801, for the election for council, assembly, sheriff, and coroners, there were 120 votes cast, and he was number 6. There were no political designations nor race were indicated on the poll records. You had to research the names of the gentlemen who were in the election in order to try to determine what party they may have been in. This is a close-up picture of the inn where Robert Aaron would have voted. As I said, it is a private residence. I have not ever spoken to the owners, but I was able to take a picture of it at Greater Crossroads and Lamington Road. Sorry. Robert Aaron. It is significant that Robert Aaron's voting record is existing because very few voting records have survived. Today's voting records are held for approximately 7 years. He was a man who was worth 50 pounds and he voted more than once in local elections. The most important significance is that he voted in the 1800 congressional election, a national election. Robert Aaron voted for the Democrat Republicans, which was the party of Thomas Jefferson. Robert Aaron is one of the earliest African Americans known to have voted in a national election and may be one of the first known African Americans to have voted in the United States. Thomas Mundy Paterson was the first African American to vote under the 15th Amendment on March 31st, 1870 in Perth Amboy in a municipal election. Robert Aaron voted in a 1797 municipal election 73 years earlier. This is a picture prior to Robert Aaron's last voting record in October 1801. Robert, a free Black, and 2 slaves purchased property in Bedminster on June 22nd, 1801 for $3 for Black people in the said neighborhood. This property was only 66 feet by 66 feet, and it was located on the main road between Bedminster and Peapack. Shortly after he purchased the property in June 1801 and voted in October 1801, Robert Aaron died. The exact date of his death is unknown, but the place of his death was Bedminster, New Jersey. His will was dated January 13th, 1802. An inventory was done in February 17th, 1802, and it was proved in March 2nd, 1802. I starred the names Rick and Yath because unfortunately, even to this day, people can't read some of the transcripts in the names, and so they get the Y's and the Z's mixed up. And also on the sign, they named one of the slaves Robert when the name should have been Rick. This is the burial ground deed from 1801. It's in the Somerset County Land Records. This transcript was courtesy of Tom Buckingham, who is a Somerset County historian. On this, you can see a little bit closer up where it talks about Zaff, Robert Aaron, and Rick. And down here, you can see that they needed to, they purchased it Black people in said neighborhood for a burial ground. When I got home from that meeting, I did find the calendar of wills, and this was in the New Jersey State Archives, and I was able, with these numbers that are listed here below, um, book 39, page 523, and also file 1188, to request his will from the state archives. Um, Now Ancestry does put a lot of the information on their website. So this is a print of his will. You can see his name, a free Black, inhabitant and freeholder in the township of Bedminster, County of Somerset. These are the people that Robert Aaron named in his will. He named his wife Mary. He named his Abraham, his grandson, eldest son of Mary. He gave him $100. He only just mentioned Anne, the daughter of said wife, as a description for Abraham, the grandson. He named Francis, son of Yath, the servant of Aaron Van Doren. He gave him $100. He gave Frank, a servant of Jacob Van Doren, $5. Robert, the son of Peter the Miller, Mr. Lynn's boy, for $5. And he also gave the Dutch Reformed Church $250. And his executors were his friends from Bernardstown and from Bedminster. And some of the witnesses was Nicholas Arrowsmith, who was an attorney at the time, and also William Ferguson, who was a Revolutionary War soldier. And I still am trying to research Maria Irwine. There are a few different spellings of her name, and it's difficult to find, but I think it's significant that there was a woman that was also a witness to his will. The value of his cemetery was $115.84, which is approximately $2,800 in 2020 dollars. His will revealed his profession. He had 7 hives of bees and 9 empty beehives, which represented 19% of his inventory and his wealth. Robert Aaron is also one of the earliest documented beekeepers in New Jersey. And that's significant too, because bees were the way that farmers could pollinate and fertilize their fruit trees and fields, and bees help to do that even today. And here in his will, in the inventory, you can see 1 cow, $12.50, 7 hives of bees, was valued at $20, and the total value was $32.50. In other parts of his will, they talk about the empty skeins of bees, and they also talk about metheglin, which is honeymead, which was liquor that was made from the bees. I put this in because Andrew Malek, if it wasn't for Andrew G. Malek, who lived from 1844 to 1895, we wouldn't have any knowledge of the burial ground, basically, or of Robert Aaron. I believe it's notated in the records in the New Jersey Historical Society that the voting records were from the papers from the old stone house, and they would have been in Andrew Malek's collection. Andrew Malek was a real estate investor and a local historian of Bedminster. He was seriously injured in a horseback riding accident in New Mexico and became a quadriplegic. He wrote the story of the old farm, or life in New Jersey, in the 18th century. He had to depend on families and friends to write his book, and he dictated letters of correspondence, over 2,000 of them, and then dictated 743 pages to complete his book in 1889. It was sold at the time for $5. And this is a picture of him on his couch in his home outside of Plainfield. His home, he had moved to Plainfield, and it's just outside of where the Plainfield Country Club is today. It's now Scotch Plains, but at that time it was Plainfield. And this is a reprint of the book from 1948. And in this book, in Andrew Malek's own words, he talks about the burial ground. It is in the confines of the old farm, which lies to the right on the east side of the highway. Before reaching it, we pass a neglected God's acre. It is the simple burial place of slaves and their prosperity, and who once formed an important element of the workaday world of this township. The headstones, if there ever were any, have long disappeared. The decrepit fences are covered with rambling growth of weeds and creeping vines, and the rains of many years have beaten level the humble mounds of the dusky toilers. Every year since 2013, we do have a memorial up there. This is a program from 2019. We did have one this year, but it was because of COVID, it was restricted to a few people. But we usually do it on the exact day. And you can see on this program that we've been able, excuse me, to identify 8 people that are buried in the burial ground. We don't know if Robert Aaron is buried there, but we would assume that he is. And this is also inside the program. We were fortunate in 2019 to have Congressman Tom Malinowski come and give a talk, as well as some of the Somerset County freeholders. Mrs. Mary Jane Fennell is a community advocate. She lives 2 doors down from the cemetery and keeps watch on it. And this is a picture of the cemetery prior to the sign being put up in 2016 from the Somerset County Historical Commission. And these are some of the sources and places I had to go in order to locate information. Some places I had no luck, some places I did have great luck. I was able to find the initial marriage record at the Hunterdon County Historical Society Library. The Holland Society Library was very helpful also. And the Zion Lutheran Church was extremely helpful. And these are some of the online resources that I used, and I'm still searching for more information. And Robert Aaron, rest in peace. And thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for sharing your wonderful research on Robert Aaron, an African-American voter in 18th century New Jersey. And we look forward to hearing more about your research in the Q&A period. Our next presenter for the panel, African-Americans and Voting Before the 15th Amendment, is Noelle Lorraine Williams. Ms. Williams is a consultant with the Newark Public Library and an independent curator, artist, and writer whose work examines the ways African Americans have utilized culture to imagine liberation. Her works have appeared across local and national spaces, publications, and media outlets. She recently curated the exhibit for the Newark Public Library titled Radical Women, Fighting for Power and the Vote in New Jersey, for which she received the Giles Wright Award for significant contributions to African-American history in New Jersey. She is currently working on her forthcoming exhibit, Black Power, 19th Century, Newark's First African-American Rebellion, and her video, Black, Native American, and Immigrant Women's Voices Taking the Vote, 100 Years of Women's Suffrage, is now available online. Her panel presentation today is titled Newark's Black Activists, 1866, Landmark Movement for the Right to Vote. And with that, I welcome Noelle Lorraine Williams.
Thank you, Nancy. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here to have heard it, and also to be able to connect some of the stories and the work that I'm doing as well. So thank you again for your work.
Thank you.
So I'm going to share this presentation with everyone. The deck is so this research that I will be sharing today, it stems from my project, Black Power 19th Century. The initial traveling exhibition will be in Newark in February 2021 at Newark Public Library. I would just like to acknowledge the work of others that have contributed to the research for this talk. Of course, Marion Thompson Wright, who was one of the country's first African-American historians, women historians, who was based in New Jersey. Rutgers University in Newark, I was a part of their American Studies, Public Humanities program, and I recently graduated. Thank you for their support of this research. The New Jersey State Archives, they were actually the first source that when I read about this, before I found Dr. Wright's essay, learned any other information, they were able to provide me with the actual test suits so that I could verify this information. So many thanks to them. Oberlin College, Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, and Radiant Roots blog by Teresa Vega, which has provided much information to the greater community about African Americans in Newark, New Jersey, and New York. So I will start. So Reverend Charles Thompson was unmistakably a Black man. In a world where looking like a white man afforded one citizenship, Thompson's body proved itself a stark contrast in the most likely white-only, male-only voting hall. If he didn't catch their attention walking in, he surely caught the attention of everyone when he proclaimed that despite the race and class barrier, he was there to submit a ballot. Reverend Charles Thompson was engaging in civil disobedience. He was there to claim his civil rights. It wasn't 1960 in Georgia or Mississippi, it was 1866 in Newark, New Jersey. He was a part of a movement, a local movement, a national movement, a movement for Black power, a movement for Black lives in Newark that extends to this present day. The exploration of Newark's 1866 landmark test suit primarily serves as a way to amplify how we think about the history of Black activism in Newark and other majority cities, Black cities in the mid-Atlantic in the 1800s. It is not a climactic story of winning, since in this case, Thompson and his partner Conover did not win their cases, but rather it continues to illuminate the various ways that African-American women, men, and children in Newark, New Jersey relentlessly fought for more than 200 years for their human rights. In many ways, the 1967 uprising in Newark had frozen in time perceptions of the city. So much so that this year's peaceful protests in Newark were applauded in both the local and national press. Even the New York Times headlines proclaimed how a city once consumed by civil unrest has kept protests peaceful. As one of the earlier large cities that elected a Black mayor, the organizing by Newark's African-American residents often draws from the 1950s, not the 1830s, where it actually began to fully form. So this project illuminates three interrelated ideas. The first is to demonstrate the ways in which local Black activists in the 1800s strategized to fight oppression in their communities. And the second, how fighting the white supremacist movement to relocate African Americans expressed through colonization helped to sharpen the analysis and organizing around African American civil rights. And finally, it illuminates some of the ways that African Americans use these local bases to connect with other local and regional bodies to push forward a national agenda. Oberlin graduate Newark's Charles Thompson, pastor of Plain Street Colored Church, and Abraham Conover, a longtime activist, were the test plaintiffs for an impartial suffrage suit I will discuss today. Impartial suffrage was a term used by both Black men and women suffragists as a way to define the type of voting rights that they were fighting for. The men, and consequently their communities, sued the state for damages in the amount of $10,000 for the city and state refusing them the right to vote. There was also a plaintiff from Wilmington, Delaware. His name was Peter S. Blake. Blake's involvement reflected the regional, cross-state, and national organizing that African Americans had engaged in for almost 100 years against slavery and for the vote. As a part of gaining national support around the test suit, the council, quote, had numerous meetings and committees appointed at those meetings in the state of New York, Newark, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. They intended to get the case tried at the state level and then to the Supreme Court of the United States. To our knowledge, the case did not make it there, but it did contribute to the activism by African Americans to claim their full civil rights. These cases did not emerge out of a vacuum. They emerged from Black communities along the Northeast corridor that had engaged in relentless activism for Black civil rights. Though they had two different strategies, both Manhattan and Newark established early formal Black institutions called African societies at the turn of the century, only 3 decades after the American Revolution, to organize and help their communities. Later, many of Black civil rights and social groups would be connected to churches. Black congregations were first following white leaders, and they would evolve into Black-led churches. And these sites would become centerpieces of Black organizing. In June 1863, Reverend Charles Thompson was installed as pastor at Plain Street Colored Church in Newark. Plain Street was Newark's second Black church that was founded in resistance to the segregation in Newark's founding white supremacist church. While most of Newark's Black activists and abolitionists were solidly against the American Colonization Society, which sought to send free African Americans, many of which had never been to Africa, to their so-called homeland, some of the leaders at Plain Street Colored Church did support African Americans finding a new home, but on their terms, not through the American Colonization Society. Potential immigration locations had included Africa, the West Indies, and Canada. A former pastor, Reverend T. Hunt, promised his family and community success in Trinidad. However, all they met was death and disorganization. He returned to Newark to caution African Americans about any repatriation schemes. Most African Americans had fought against the colonization movement for decades. Actually, 2 of the largest Black conventions in the 1800s were convened to discuss repatriation, colonization, and later to register on the public record their hatred for it. They didn't feel that they needed to leave a country that they and their ancestors had given blood, sweat, and tears to, a country that squeezed the gristle of their bones, raped women, and sold children. No, they were going to stay. Activists from Newark participated in all of the early Black conventions. Their cause was clear: stop the trade of their family and friends and community members, provide assistance to those who decided to both flee and migrate, and finally gain the right to vote. However, for New Jersey's African American men and women, their claim to the vote differed from claims by other African Americans and white women in other states, because they possessed the right to vote prior to 1807. when a legislative enactment banned them to keep them out. By 1844, things changed when the state constitution was formally amended to exclude African-American men, African-American women, and white women, and others. Marion Thompson Wright wrote, quote, "Negroes suffered a setback in their fight for their privileges of free men. They now had to wrestle with a constitutional provision rather than a legislative enactment. However, two significant frameworks would undergird their claim to the vote. The fact that African Americans paid taxes and deserve representation. Another woman or suffragist we have heard who iterated this fact was Lucy Stone in her pursuit of the vote, as well as others. And that also, that their families had lived in this country for decades in comparison to immigrants who are now allowed to vote only after a very short period. Shortly before Thompson and Conover suit, the National Equal Rights League was one of the earliest non-religious national organizations for African Americans, established expressly to address their civil rights. It developed both state and local branches called Equal Rights Leagues. Samuel G. Gould of New Jersey attended the 1865 National Equal Rights League Convention and was elected as one of the vice presidents of the executive committee. William Day and Edwin Freeman from Newark attended the convention as well. It was composed of African-American men from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Virginia, Tennessee, Michigan, North Carolina, Illinois, Connecticut, and Utah. During their meeting, they shared their experiences with the violence of white supremacy and stressed that acquiring property, educating their children, and using Black teachers to educate them. They emphasized their continuing patriotism, loyalty, and justice should be a major consideration in winning their petitions for suffrage. They also stated that they were against the colonization of Blacks in Africa and elsewhere and planned to establish an office in a central location, namely Philadelphia. It was clear that the solution for many Black men and women was to stay and to fight for the rights that their ancestors had claimed. So when Charles Thompson became the pastor at Plain Street Colored Church, he followed a long line of social justice activist pastors dedicated to African American liberation through anti-slavery work, education, and the vote. Reverend Samuel Cornish, the editor of the first national African American newspaper, Freedom's Journal in 1827, was also a pastor at the Newark Church, which Thompson joined prior to him. Cornish was one of the most fiery opponents to the colonization scheme, as it was called, and even directly confronted Newark's leaders, including statesman and NYU president Theodore Frelinghuysen. An especially bold move, since Frelinghuysen was a colonization leader and contributed to building of the all-Black Plain Street Colored Church. In Kenneth H. Marshall's 2011 analysis of literature about enslaved Black men in New Jersey in the 19th century called Manhood Enslaved, he explains the violence, complicity, and contradictions of Black men engaging Christian institutions for political work. This does not mean, he writes, however, that the bondmen were insincere Christians. Certainly, the important role that Kofi played in the spiritual lives of his Black co-religionists, making sure, for example, that they were prayed for at their funeral, is indicative of someone who took religion seriously. Yet the reality of his and Dick's existence as large Black men in a racially hostile society does raise the issue of how their religiosity possibly served multiple functions as a source of enlightenment, salvation, self-worth, service, less discernible protection. What is significant about Marshall's exploration of the role of faith and religion in the lives of African-American men is how an institution of religion both limited and served as a tool for liberation. In 1866, various newspapers announced this, quote, test suit for impartial suffrage in New Jersey. They wrote, "The Executive Council of the Colored Men of New Jersey have begun 3 suits, 2 in the Supreme Court of that state and on the Circuit Court of the United States, to test whether a Black man has a right to franchise." They continued, "To the Friends of Impartial Suffrage. The undersigned were appointed and recognized at several mass meetings of the colored citizens of New Jersey and of all the states, that any state that disenfranchises any portions of its citizen on account of color is in that respect anti-Republican and in violation of the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees a Republican form of government to every state, and with full power to enlist the press, raise money, employ counsel, and to institute legal proceedings in the court." They continued, "State and national, for the immediate recognition and enforcement of impartial suffrage, and to carry the question up to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1 or more national test suits for final adjudication and decision, and cooperated with and invite cooperation from other states." Quote, "Numerous meetings and committee appointed at those meetings in the states in New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware have by resolutions requested us to act on their behalf, and other states are moving in the same direction by concert of their action, so that we feel authorized to call ourselves a national council and to receive and cooperative action from all the states." In this way, the organizers were able to expand on the national networks that they had built from the colored conventions. For example, leaders from Newark attended the first annual Convention of People of Color in the city of Philadelphia in 1831. Several were from Newark, New Jersey, and Trenton. Delegates would also hail from other Black abolitionist concentrated cities, including Brooklyn, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and many more. Charles H. Thompson and Abraham Conover, both from Newark, initiated their suits after they were refused the right to vote in Newark on October 16th. The cases in Newark were planned as acts of civil disobedience. They knew that the registrars would refuse to enlist them as voters. The formal complaints were filed on October 27th, 1866. For these test suits, they used, quote, 3 types of Black men, end quote, writing, quote, "One of the complainants is a Black, one a mulatto, and one an octoroon. One is a freedman and the other one freedman born. One is a clergyman and one a citizen soldier, has fought and bled for his country. All are men of education and refinement, taxpayers, possessed of property, and have all the qualifications of legal voters in their respective election precincts. Unless color merely be a disqualification, the suit covers the whole ground and will settle the legal status of the colored man under the Constitution and the laws of the United States. The suits will be prosecuted with all diligence, so that it's believed that one, at least, will have reached the Supreme Court of the United States at the next December term." We know the most about Thompson and Conover. He was the complainants described as, quote, Black, due to his dark skin. The other 2 probably visually look closer to stereotypes of Black and white multiracial people. Thompson had attended Oberlin College. In 1835, Oberlin College was the first college to admit Black men to its student body, and later on included Black and white women. Though she would graduate, more than 20 years after Thompson, Mary Church Terrell, founding member of the National Association of Colored Women and the NAACP, also attended Oberlin, as well as other significant Black activists in the United States. Charles Thompson was born in Pennsylvania in 1826. His parents were instrumental in the Underground Railroad. After leaving Oberlin, he was a pastor in New York and Brooklyn, leading at another well-known activist Underground Railroad church in Brooklyn called Siloam Presbyterian Church. In Brooklyn, he met his wife and moved to New Jersey, and finally the Newark Church. But surely, voting activism did not begin in New Jersey with Thompson and Conover's test suit. In 1849, there was Mount Pisgah African Methodist Episcopal Church and later Mount Zion Church in Trenton to discuss participating in elections. And also indicated that in 1849, the North Star reported that they circulated a petition and sent lecturers throughout the state to submit by petitioning the state legislature. The petition had specific instructions, including separating the signatures of the whites from the Blacks. This indicated a state level strategy that they had engaged in, which, as we know from looking at white and Black women's suffragists activism, it initially started at the state level as well. Later, Thompson Wright highlights actions of African Americans in Trenton in 1863 and 1864. Finally, in 1866, she wrote, quote, "Colored citizens from Essex, Cumberland, Mercer, Burlington, and Atlantic counties, and from the city of Rahway requested the legislature to strike the word white from the Constitution. All of these prayers, what we would know as petitions, were tabled without action." The 1860 suit, however, found national support from several individual political supporters, as well as other impartial suffrage leagues. The Equal Rights Convention publicized their support of the test suit. They wrote that this convention approves of the test suits brought by the New Jersey Impartial Suffrage Council, acting nationally on behalf of the right of impartial suffrage under the Constitution of the United States, and that we respectfully recommend to the New Jersey Council that they employ a colored lawyer in such suits, in addition to the eminent legal gentlemen already retained by them. So what we see is that even during that period, the whole idea of representation and of Black-led leadership was a debate and discussion amongst Black activists during the period, because for the national test suit, they had employed white lawyers for the beginning of the test suit. In conclusion, though Thompson Wright concluded, and I tentatively concur, though Dr. Thompson Wright concluded, and I tentatively concur, that this case never made it to the Supreme Court, there's still more research needed. Despite not reaching the Supreme Court, the case becomes a very public strike against dehumanization and for civil rights that Newark community members in alliance with those from other parts of the nation would be a part of, that would be a part of their future strategies. In 1867, the Republican Convention would actually vote yes for a suffrage amendment. Surely the activism by African Americans influenced that. Though their case would not be the direct catalyst for the 15th Amendment, Thompson and other Newark Black activists, including Frederick Douglass, would host a large celebration in downtown Newark after its passage. Later, Thompson would move to the South, continuing his activism as a professor at Straight University, now Dillard University, a school created by the American Missionary Association that, according to one scholar, worked to train Black missionaries and to provide legal training to students to help support civil rights in the South. Anthony Conover would continue to live in Newark and support the community there. Though I was not able to explore the relationship of New Jersey business leaders to the South in this paper, we cannot help in the 1800s, we cannot help to admire folks like Thompson and Conover, who basically went up against a New Jersey legislature that had for more than 60 years served virtually as a watchdog for Southern plantations. And later the businesses that would continue after slavery through their adherence to both the fugitive slave law legislature, but by also courting public disapproval of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. So basically what I was saying was that Abraham Conover and Charles Thompson faced a hostile atmosphere to African-American rights in New Jersey. And this is evidenced in the ways that New Jersey adhered to the fugitive slave law, with the exception of certain decisions, as well as the economic allegiance that I actually explore more in Black Power in 19th century and next year in the exhibition, where the businesses in Newark were aligned to the South. Which proved to be very difficult, including not supporting the 13th Amendment, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation. However, the community continued to fight and create. And so here I've shared an article about some of the women who continued to work and who were the descendants of these Black abolitionists who were doing work as early as the 1807. The woman pictured to the left is Brenda Morrick Ray. Her grandfather had engaged in activism in the early 1800s in Brooklyn, as well as Newark, and she would be a contributor to the Harlem Renaissance. And also in the picture, there's James Weldon Johnson's wife, who was a feminist and an activist. She didn't live in Newark, she lived in Manhattan. As well as an image of the Sojourner Truth Branch YWCA, which African-American women fought for here in Newark, and which we also share in the Radical Women video. I can share the link for that, as well as the exhibition to indicate how this activism continued over decades. In closing, I will share a quote from Dr. J.S. Rock's 1849 Memorial to the Assembly. "We have done nothing to cause our disenfranchisement. On the contrary, we have done all a people could do to entitle them to be enfranchised." Thank you.
And thank you, Noel, for your wonderful research and presentation. And so we will now open the session for questions and answers. As a reminder, please type any questions you have into the chat window. And if I overlook your question, please feel free to retype it into the chat window. And so, in the chat window, we have lots of congratulations to both of you for a wonderful and excellent series of presentations. And again, thank you for sharing your insights. And both of you are bringing to light these moments of historical invisibilization or historical amnesia. In your case, Nancy, bringing to light the fact that in the state of New Jersey, there were free Blacks who indeed voted in New Jersey elections who met the property or money requirement. And then by the early 19th century, with the shift towards universal white male suffrage, that opening with respect to the franchise is going to come to an end. And in your presentation, Noel, you're also seeing the ways in which Blacks in New Jersey still carry with them that historical memory of that period when they were able to vote, at least free Blacks in the early 19th century, and how that's going to also inform a lot of the activism throughout the 19th century, early 19th century of Blacks in Newark who are going to fight to regain this right. And so there's a lot of wonderful information in both of your presentations, and I understand that in a 20-minute conversation, there's lots of stuff that has to get cut. And so this is a moment for you to share any other wonderful research that you think is relevant to our conversation today that you weren't able to present in your 20-minute segment.
Well, I think I'll just say briefly, I really can't get into the research I wasn't able to share, because basically what interested me the most about it was how the activists continued to do various kinds of work and engage various strategies. And so I would kind of fall into like a pit of looking at various strategies. But just to respond briefly to this whole concept of memory, the memory of the franchise. When I was preparing the exhibition, Radical Women, with my colleagues at the Newark Public Library and Dr. George Robb at William Paterson, one of the things that really came out of the research was this strategy that white women suffragists and African-American impartial suffrage workers used of reclaiming this right to vote, and how that differed so much from other states and gave some kind of footing to the women, but also to African-American men and women during the period. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get to read much writing in the 1800s by African-American women about reclaiming this right? More of what we learn about the vote in New Jersey as far as how African-American women felt is more in the 1910s, 1911, unlike that period. But as someone who studied activism and activist strategies, I found that to be particularly compelling. And so one of the things I just loved about Nancy's presentation is that it kind of, it bolsters what I've been exploring in my research about how these African-American communities started so early in trying to create place. Nancy talks about the cemetery and engaging in these process. I mean, so that, it's not just like this kind of first level research that we find in activist works across feminism, across pro-Black activism, right? Whereas people are just kind of discovering things, but how these are all really like building blocks on how people attempted to create community here in New Jersey for African Americans.
Thank you, Noel. And Nancy, anything that you would like to?
Well, I see there's a question from Meg in the chat room about how did I know that Robert Aaron voted Democrat, Republican? I had to trace back who he voted for, and I believe he voted for Henry Southard, and you could trace back who the men were and what party they were in. So it took a little bit of research. The only thing I wish that the New Jersey Historical Society would put online the voting records. I think they're really significant, and I think it would do them a lot of good to put the voting record online so that other people can research it.
In the chat window, I'm sorry. In the chat window, there's a question from Sarah Curtin. To either of you, do you know of other Black men or women who voted under the New Jersey Constitution of 1776? And Sue Kozel, earlier in the chat window, noted that she recently published an article for the New Jersey Education Review in October of 2020, which includes names of Black voters before 1800. So first I'll open the floor to Nancy and Noel, and then maybe Sue could also chime in to that response.
Well, I did find the 4 women that I noted in my presentation. They were the only 4 so far that I've been able to find. And it was difficult, as Sue notated. There's a lot of times on the voting records, there wasn't a notation of that Robert Aaron was African American. Only one voting record had like an erasure, and I don't know what that indicated, but not an erasure of his name, but an erasure next to his name. So maybe somebody was trying to indicate that or not, but it wasn't there. I found it in his will, and also the deed notated the race of the gentleman.
I don't, the only thing that I would be able to contribute to this is that we know that there were actually, I'm just going to actually leave it at one point. In Philadelphia right now, there's an exhibition that actually explores the voting in New Jersey prior to 1807. I haven't seen it, and I generally do not recommend things that I haven't seen myself, but I'm sure people can explore it more with that. And then also, as Jason indicated, I'm sorry, your name is Sue, the link that she also provided.
And along those lines, Noel, there's some wonderful articles about that exhibition at the Museum of the American Revolution. And one of the curators of that exhibit did note an individual named Ephraim Hagerman, who in 1801, it seems, voted in Montgomery Township. Next to his name in the voting rolls was the word Negro. But Sue may also have, Sue is mentioning in the chat window that there were 3 Black men. Could you put those names in the chat window, Sue? That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Let me just copy, let me see if I can copy this text. I'm putting it in the chat room now. Hello, everyone. This was a fascinating session. I want to thank you. My brain's exploding. And Jason, you were so generous in the way you incorporated questions with the scholarship of these 2 great presenters. So Phil Mead provided a list from 1801. He said that there were other African Americans prior to that period, but the names that I published were from 1801 from Montgomery Township, and that was courtesy of Phil Mead from the Museum of the American Revolution. So I hope that answers that question. I guess I should turn off.
Well,
so thank you, Jason, for that little break. Okay.
I can say this, that in the Somerset County Historical Quarterlies, there are a list of names. The only way you could determine the race is to go back and do genealogy searches on all the people. And it would take quite a bit of time to do that. There could be more African Americans that are listed there. I just happen to know it was Robert Aaron from my work up in Bedminster. And I also see in the chat room that Kate asked a question about bee pollination. I do think that his profession gave him a lot more status with regards to the local community in Bedminster, because you have to remember that at that time, everybody were farmers and they needed to pollinate their fields. And in fact, the Malek farms descendants still have farms up in the Bedminster, Hunterdon County area. So the beekeeping was important. And I also did research by calling the state beekeeper that we have. And beekeeping in New Jersey was only documented, the Beekeeping Association only goes back 100 years. So Robert Aaron predates that by 100 years. I also went to the Epicurean conference and talked to somebody who was an expert there. And she was also amazed that I could document a beekeeper that early in an African-American beekeeper. So it's just a fascinating story about Robert Aaron. And that's really what probably helped with the sign up there in Somerset County, because it changed the story from a piece of land to an actual agricultural profession. And so I think it was easier for people to digest to put the sign up and to also offer the fact that he was a beekeeper up there.
Wonderful. There's a question from Don Stetch. Were there any notable New Jersey politicians, governors, legislators, candidates, et cetera, that were supportive of universal suffrage, or at least for African-American men in the 1800s?
Yes, there were a few, but most notably it was Governor Marcus Ward. When he ran for office, a part of running for office, I believe, was that he was going to ratify the 13th Amendment. And because New Jersey had not ratified it on the initial voting ratification opportunity to do it. So he did support the 13th Amendment. And then later on, he supported the activism of the men for this impartial suffrage suit. And so it's really interesting to me learning more about Marcus Ward, because I'm studying him for another reason. But one of the first articles I actually found about Marcus Ward was at the New Jersey Historical Society, where he was writing, defending himself to people who were accusing him of being an abolitionist. And, that was the first article I read about him. And I was just like, okay, why, I had kind of negative feelings about him. And, but I also questioned, why were people doing this? And so in studying this case more and learning more about Marcus Ward, I see that with his support later of the 13th Amendment, and then also finally this support of the impartial suffrage, how so many moderate folks would often have this kind of strange space of defending their allegiance to the general white community, while also promoting the citizenship of African Americans. And so you see a lot of those tensions in the literature from that period, which is interesting to look at now in 2020. As we discuss race and civil rights, and how people define themselves and their communities and families with regard to those issues.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
From Tate's question about beekeeping? People have to remember that Bedminster was the site of the artillery camp during the Revolutionary War that Henry Knox had designed up there. It's now where the hills are in Bedminster. And so my hypothesis, my theory is that Robert Aaron probably supplied some of the troops with honeymead in order to keep them, engaged in the Revolutionary War, but I haven't been able to prove that yet. But Washington would have used General Washington and Henry Knox. They couldn't always pay the men, so that sometimes they paid them with liquor. So that's one of my theories that I'm trying to work out. But you have to know the geography of the area to understand the importance of what Robert Aaron did as a profession.
Well, it's 12:05, and unfortunately, that's the official designated time for our panel to end. This is obviously a conversation that could continue all afternoon. I do encourage audience members to reach out to Nancy and Noel to continue the conversation. And I want to thank them both for their wonderful, important, and insightful presentations. And to those of you in attendance, please join us for the remainder of the conference. Thank you to you all. Thank you again, Noel and Nancy.
And thank you for your hard work.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.